let's talk about fanciful titles on whiskey bottles. I picked this one for a very specific reason. Also, this was a gift from Mike Russo, a whiskey somm, and I am really looking forward to it if I can figure out how to open it. Okay, this was a comment in the Facebook Whiskey Vault Facebook group from Brian Harris, who said, hey, what about deceptive marketing practices and do's and don'ts of deceptive marketing practices? And I said, what if we just talked about the fact that fanciful titles on a bottle can often be used for ill or for good? And you'll see why I picked Ardbeg for this video and a discussion about fanciful titles. So, what are fanciful titles? This is kind of a nerdy conversation as well as a marketing conversation. What I mean by that is the legal technical definition of that with TTB, the Federal Beverage Code Administrators. And what they mean is a fanciful title is any wording on a label that isn't legally required to be there and has no legally defined meaning. That's it, a fanciful title, right? Now, descriptors, that's a different category, but also not policed, as long as you don't use the descriptor to state incorrect things, right? But the things that are policed on here, 17 years, that's policed. The proof in the AVB, actually, I'll show you this. Here's a label approval thing. I have a piece of paper, but we're gonna pop it up on the screen. The things that are legally required for a whiskey are listed on this. That's the only thing. So the brand name is required. So Ardbeg, right? The name and address is required. That's on the back. It's listed right here. Ardbeg Distillery, and then imported by, that's an additional one. The alcohol content's required, that's right here. The health warning statement, the government warning label, right here is required, and it has to be in that font and in that spacing and that bolded. It's very specific. The country of origin has to be there. The class type and designation, which is whiskey, and in this case, Scotch whiskey, right? Is a legal type and class designation. Now, American Beverage Code says about Scotch, what is the definition of Scotch? The answer is whatever Scotland says it is. So as long as Scotland approves this label, America goes, yep, they don't have anything to say about it. And then the net contents and volume, that's 750 milliliters, that's legally required. Other than that, everything else can either not be there, or if it's there, it has to follow certain rules. So you can't say things that they decide are intentionally misleading, right? And we've talked, actually, I'll talk about this in another video, distilled spirit specialties, right? I don't remember if I did that. I feel like I did that. Anyway, things like Kentucky bourbon finished in port wine barrels, that, Angel's Envy, that's a actual designation legally of that product because it's a distilled spirit specialty. So that falls under the class type designation of a legal product, right? The reason that Crown Royal got in trouble for Crown Royal bourbon mash was because bourbon has legal definitions in the US and it doesn't in Canada. So that label was fine in Canada, but it wasn't fine in America, right? It got penalized. Now, there are other things on a bottle, and there's not really any, well, there's a few on here, that are not legally policed in any way whatsoever, and they have to do, I'm just going to put that there, they are called fanciful titles. And on this bottle of Ardbeg 17, it would be things like The Ultimate or Committee Exclusive. Those are considered fanciful title or fanciful wording. They're not legally policed in any way whatsoever as long as they're not misleading against the things that are legally required. So I'm going to talk about what happens when you know this and you have nefarious or at least, vague intentions, or maybe you have good intentions. But first we're going to try Ardbeg 17 and screw it, I'm going to pour a little more. I'm excited about this one because this was a resurrection. When Ardbeg was brought back to life, the distillery was brought back to life, one of the first things that they released as a formal release from the revived distillery was Ardbeg 17. Not one of the first things, but like one of the core important ones. And it sort of relaunched, I should say. It relaunched Ardbeg into the world. And this was back in the day when committee releases were the actual insiders only. And but the 17 was just this like, hey guys, we're here, we're back, we're doing amazing stuff. And it sort of put Ardbeg back into the world. Over time, as Ardbeg got real popular, they've sort of started dropping age statements and moving backwards into, wait for it, fanciful titles. Because fanciful titles don't require age statements or anything like that. They let you do, 10 different releases with fanciful titles instead of an age statement release. I have no problem with that because I think the obsession with age statements is overrated. But I think on the other side of the pendulum, you can definitely get tired of too many fanciful title releases. For me as an Ardbeg drinker, I love Ardbeg, but I've just gotten so overwhelmed with the sheer volume of types of releases that they do that I just can't keep up. And so I sort of found myself just going like, oh, I'll just sit back and wait for someone to go, hey, this is one you really need to try. Now, when they brought back the 17, I was really excited. And Mike brought us this one. I wasn't expecting that at all. I was going to try to track one down. But Bill Lumsden, evidently the blender for this, spent a very real amount of time trying to recreate the previous release of the Ardbeg 17. So this is the closest I'm going to get, probably, to getting to taste and smell what the original Revival 17-year-old age statement Ardbeg was. And it smells like Ardbeg. My Ardbeg to me is of all the Islas, is the most meaty smoke. I always use the word proteiny, and what I mean by that is burnt meat, right? And I even mean that other than Octomore, which is actually like barbecue. I mean the smoke impact in this one on the normal Ardbegs. It always has weight and body to it that Lafroy doesn't have, that Lagavulin doesn't have, the Cahuilla definitely doesn't have. Killoman hints at sometimes. Port Charlottes get close, but Ardbeg sort of stands alone in this sort of low mids heavy smoky whiskey. It sometimes reminds me of the sort of dense wetness of old seashells mixed with a camping fire on the beach. And this one has all of that, but it smells soft and approachable instead of just like brash and hey. 40%. Whoa. I kind of want more. I wasn't expecting that. I don't know that I've ever picked up. Okay, so Wee Beastie doesn't have a long finish. It's 5-year-old Ardbeg. It's big, bold in the palate, and hey, ha! And then it's sort of about 3/4 of the way, it just goes boom, and leaves behind this sort of like lingering smokiness. But it comes into the palate throwing elbows. This one comes into the palate gently gliding with all the same markers of smoke and ash and honey and vanillins. But then about 1/2 to 3/4 of the way, it also drops off the way that Wee Beastie did. Although the lingering aftertaste of the 17 is sweetness instead of ash. And then there's a little bit of smoke on the breath as you breathe around it. That's interesting. I wonder how close it is to the actual Revival 17. It's very gentle. It's one of the more gentle, approachable, smoky whiskeys I've had from Islay. It's definitely the most approachable Ardbeg I've ever had, as far as just like easygoing. Added some water to that. I'm going to let it sit for a little bit. Okay. There are a couple of things that you can do with fanciful titles that are not things like the Ultimate and Committee Exclusive, which are just brand things, right? You can ignore those. You can put numbers on your label. Jack Daniels. Now, number 7 is a reference to distillery licensing, right? Jack Daniels. Everyone knows Jack Daniels number 7, right? But I know more than I'm comfortable knowing of interactions I've had with people who thought that Jack Daniels was 7 years old. And there's an example of where a fanciful statement, Jack Daniels number 7, becomes a sort of potentially misleading moniker on a bottle for people who don't know what they're reading and what they're looking at. There are endless lists of words like handcrafted, small batch, premium, deluxe, and so on. Those are all fanciful titles. They mean nothing. But I have many times seen brands that I'm not going to call anybody else. Jack Daniels can handle it. I'm not going to call anybody else, but I have seen labels where they've put things on there that it took even me a while to realize weren't age statements or weren't a product statement. And then I was like, wait, hang on, what? Because I didn't look closely and I just made assumptions, right? That's a way in which fanciful titles can sort of mislead you. That's why, anyway, that's why Bourbon Mash on Crown Royal got shut down, because it was a fanciful title to them and a legal title in the US. Now, on the other hand, so just be careful and know that unless it's on that graphic, it's not policed, and they can say whatever they want, and it doesn't mean anything except for what they want you to think. Fair? Okay. Now, on the other hand, you can use fanciful titles to drive change in an entire industry. Now, I mentioned this in the last video. Actually, I don't remember what order I'm releasing these in. But if I haven't mentioned it, on this date of shooting, December 18th, American Single Malt officially became a new category in American whiskey. For the first time, a new whiskey category has been created since 1968, and the light whiskey category was created. There are thousands and thousands of people who have spent thousands and thousands of hours working their butts off over the last 20 years to create the category of American Single Malt, and then to create standards, and then to get the federal government to adopt it as a thing so that we could create product inside the parameters that are recognized by the rest of the world as single malt whiskey. Used oak, things like this. During the window when very few people were making single malt, and there was no legal designation for single malt, Balcones entered the world, and they created labels. Now I want you to look at this. This is the label that Balcones has been using for ages, right? I mean, not this one, but the type of label and the type of styling. Look what's in here. Single malt. See that? There is no legal designation for single malt. Now there is, but there wasn't for the 15 years, 16 almost, that Balcones has been around, right? What they did was, TTB says, if you put a legal designation, which for here is Texas whiskey, right? Or whiskey. If you put language on there that was the same font and color as Texas whiskey, then you are putting legal class type designation on a label, and you can't do that because there's no such thing as Texas single malt whiskey. It would fail the TTB regulations. But TTB, in their wisdom, says, well, if you just put the words single malt in a different color and a different font, then it's considered a fanciful title, and it will not be included in your product class type designation statement. So for TTB, Texas whiskey is the class type designation, and single malt is a fanciful title. Brands like Westland, McCarthy's, Hood River, and then McCarthy's, St. George, on and on, right? Del Bach, all of these guys put the words single malt on their bottle for decades, even though it was considered a fanciful title. But what it allowed them to do was create public awareness in America for a category of whiskey called single malt whiskey. It was the beginning of a journey that ends with, today when I'm shooting, an actual federal designation for a category of whiskey. So sometimes fanciful titles can change the world in a good way. I hope that was interesting to you. Cheers to you. Wait, hang on. I put water in this. Let me go back real quick. Ooh, okay. It propped up the sort of charred, toasted peaches and pears. Sort of burnt marshmallowy vanilla, and then a lot of salt water and smoke and ash. The palate just simplified into nothingness. Way better without water. Drink it as it is. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here. If you like fanciful titles, I don't have anything for that. Like and subscribe to the fanciful title of the Whiskey Vault.